Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. I'm so thrilled you're here. Today, we're going to put on our macroeconomic analyst hats to explore a question that, honestly, absolutely fascinates me. Why exactly are government budgets skyrocketing all over the globe? And, by extension, why do our tax contributions matter now more than ever? You see, public expenditure occupies a truly central place in the study of public finance. Governments don't just raise revenues or collect public debt for the fun of it, right? They collect it with the ultimate aim of spending it to actually perform their varied functions. In fact, public expenditure holds the exact same crucial place in public finance that consumption holds in general economics. It is literally the engine. But what fuels that engine? And why does it constantly seem to need more fuel? Well, let's take a look.
Okay, let's dive right in. We'll be using an analytical framework today, breaking this down into 5 distinct economic forces. First, the rise in prices. Second, the growth of the public sector. Third, economic assistance to the private sector. Fourth, the massive expansion of development programs. And finally, the growing trend of urbanization.
So, let's start with our first driver. Number 1, the rise in prices and the overarching cost of inflation. You know, when we usually think about inflation, we're picturing our own grocery bills, or maybe the cost of a cup of coffee. But it's so important to remember that the government is essentially the largest consumer in the entire economy. After the Second World War, there's been this gradual, sustained increase in the price level in pretty much every single country around the world. Because of this macroeconomic inflation, governments are forced to spend significantly more money just to acquire the exact same amount of goods and services they need. Their purchasing power decreases, which means their expenditure must automatically increase just to maintain the absolute baseline status quo.
But here's the catch. It's not just the cost of physical goods and materials going up. The state is also a massive employer. So the crucial point here is that as the cost of living rises for everyday citizens, well, it also rises for government workers. The government has to continuously increase salaries and what is known as dearness allowance, or DA, for its own employees. So inflation actually hits the government budget twice. Once on the goods and services they buy, and then again on the massive payroll they have to maintain. It's a real double whammy.
Moving right along, that brings us to driver number 2, the sheer growth of the public sector and scaling state enterprise.
In both capitalist and mixed economies, we've seen a completely massive expansion in state enterprise outlays over the decades. And to brilliantly illustrate just how astronomical that growth can be, consider the historical data for India's public sector outlay. During the first 5-year plan, the public sector outlay was just 1,960 crore rupees. Now, fast forward to the 10th plan, which covered 2002 to 2007, and that number exploded to 15,092,300 crore rupees. Then, looking at the 11th plan, covering 2007 to 2012, the total outlay was placed at an astonishing 36,044,718 crore rupees.
I really want to pause here and emphasize the sheer velocity of that spending growth. Let that sink in for a second. The 11th plan public sector outlay more than doubled the total outlay of the previous 10th plan. In just a 5-year span, the financial commitment from the state didn't just grow incrementally, it absolutely multiplied. As the public sector takes on more responsibilities and scales up its enterprises, the public expenditure required to actually fund it scales exponentially alongside it.
All right, on to our third driver, assistance to the private sector, which heavily involves subsidizing industry.
Now, this one might seem a bit counterintuitive at first glance. We typically think of public money being strictly for public institutions, right? However, a major driver of public expenditure is actually the subsidization of private enterprise. Modern states frequently provide direct economic assistance and financial aid to various private industries. And you might be wondering, why do they do that? Well, because these private industries are very often the ones undertaking the absolutely crucial programs of planned national development. To ensure these big development projects actually get off the ground, the government steps in with subsidies, which of course pushes total public expenditure even higher.
Which naturally leads us right into driver number 4, development programs, or as I like to think of it, funding the future.
A truly massive reason for the recent rise in public expenditure is the government's aggressive expansion into structural development activities. To really grasp the scale of this, we need a historical baseline. If we look back at the 1950 to 51 period, the combined center and state development expenditure accounted for 36.2% of total spending. The remaining 63.8% was spent on other non-developmental activities.
Okay, now let's fast forward to see how this builds over time. By recent years, specifically looking at the 2015-16 data, development expenditure jumped incredibly to represent 59.6% of total expenditure. That is a fundamental, ground-up shift in how the state allocates its resources. Development is no longer just a slice of the budget pie, it is the dominating force driving the entire budget forward.
So where exactly is all this development money actually flowing? Governments are giving incredibly high priority to the physical development of infrastructure. We're talking about massive, extremely capital-intensive projects here. Things like the development of expansive road networks, the building and upgrading of entire railway systems, the construction of intricate canal networks, and of course, the vital production of energy. These are monumental tasks that require equally monumental levels of public expenditure to execute.
And finally, we reach our fifth economic driver, the growing trend of urbanization and the ensuing demographic shift. You see, when demographics shift on a large scale, the government's financial responsibilities are radically altered. With the rapid spread of urbanization, public expenditure has had to increase heavily in modern times just to keep pace. To set the context here, shortly after independence in 1951, the percentage of India's population living in urban areas was just 17.3%. It was a predominantly rural demographic landscape.
Now, what's truly fascinating is the sheer, overwhelming scale of the demographic explosion that followed. By 2011, that urban population percentage had nearly doubled, hitting 31.2%. Try to think about the actual physical reality of that number. We're talking about millions upon millions of citizens migrating into highly concentrated city centers over just a few decades.
As citizens flock to these cities, the existing infrastructure is instantly pushed to the absolute limit. Urbanization effectively forces the government to dramatically increase spending across the board just to provide essential, everyday amenities. We're talking about vastly scaled-up civil and city administration. We're talking about engineering incredibly complex water supply systems for millions of dense households. It requires building urban parks, massively expanding public health facilities, and constructing entirely new schools to provide education for a booming urban youth population. Actually, when you think about it, every single person moving to a city represents a brand new, required unit of public expenditure.
So let's pull all of this together. We've seen how post-war inflation drives up the baseline cost of quite literally everything a government does. We've seen the raw data showing public sector outlays doubling in mere 5-year windows. We've learned how public funds heavily subsidize private industries to fuel big national goals. We've watched development spending consume nearly 60% of total budgets to build vital infrastructure. And finally, we've seen how the unstoppable tide of urbanization forces continuous, heavy investment into city administration and public amenities. These 5 economic drivers don't just exist in a vacuum, right? They compound on top of one another every single year. Which leaves us with one incredibly pressing question to ponder. As all of these economic forces continue to accelerate, how exactly will we finance the next 50 years of public expenditure? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and I'll see you next time.